Okay, so I guess this is going to be a summarized and condensed sort of focus on the political COVID-19 response. So I'm very grateful for this crisis, um, because I do think that it's a reflection of the radicalization in culture that has been predominantly caused by, you could either say feminist ideology or intersectional proto-fascistic sort of ideology or identity politics in general. That what we see predominantly is a failing of institutions, a failing of standards, a failing of the liberal order, or the liberal order that has been failed by a kind of institutionalized corruption in the media, in journalism, the standards, the basic fundamental sort of ethical standards that are meant to enshrine and hold up an open liberal democratic society. We see this also with the South African Human Rights Commission, which, as far as I can tell, is a bunch of politically planted political hacks that should all be tried for constitutional damages or anti-constitutional propaganda. I mean, this is an institution that, in some sense, lives to propagate the kind of hysteria and the kind of cultural and moral prerequisite to having a kind of authoritarianism, a kind of and I'm going to talk about the nature of this authoritarianism, because this is exactly the same kind of authoritarianism and how it was culturally spread in Weimar Germany and later in Nazi Germany. Um, so essentially, what puts us perhaps proximately the proximate cause of what puts us in this position is essentially journalism, is the commentarian sorry the commentary elite in society, which every society needs to have thought leaders. They need to have people who discuss ideas. They need to have people that investigate, because life is complicated. Reality is complex, and you need real, honest investigation into it, and you need to sort of shine a spotlight on debate, and you need to have robust debate. We don't have robust debate anymore. What we have is we have a bunch of sanctimonious people who have stolen the moral high ground, and they grandstand and they ply their skepticism, and everybody else who wishes to speak against them get pilloried by their accusatorial unilateral dictation of the narrative, and essentially have to prove a negative just to enter the public debate, essentially, because they hold an orthodox position which they have claimed and have not substantiated. And the reason why we know that this orthodoxy is poisonous, is toxic, is because it has infringed the liberal order, and it has never made a proper substantiated case. It has never fully made its case. Now, this is a common theme in identity politics, that you use a double standard, and then you allow yourself the moral latitude to then go further and do precautionary things in the way of promoting your moral double standard. And this creates a kind of negative feedback loop where you can insulate your own moral ineptitude and your own unethical position with more and more extravagant precautionary measures. Now, this same formula, you can see it in the COVID-19 political response, is that when you, for example, quarantine healthy people, quarantine is meant to be used against people who are sick. But when you use quarantine against people who are healthy, that's a precautionary measure against almost a kind of skeptical, and how it's defended like a double standard, is that, okay, well, we're allowed to make this public health policy, somehow it must just be assumed to be reasonable, and they are never going to actually substantiate it. I mean, they always said we're doing a lockdown essentially to mitigate the pressure on public health resources, that it's just to essentially cope with the inundation in hospital wards. That is the rationale, and that's a perfectly workable rationale. That's a perfectly reasonable rationale. But it no longer became about that. It became a never-ending precautionary measure. So instead of applying the right level of solution at the right level of analysis, which is that government should expand convalescent wards and should expand ICU wards and things like that, that government should respond by increasing the public health resource capacity. Instead, it's just the never-ending precautionary measure, and which infringes the liberal order. And even when now this seems, at least hypothetically, it's tenuous to even continue to make that kind of claim. In fact, the only reason why it's possible to make that claim is because no one has done the proper research into working out what the actual level of herd immunity is, or what the actual level of people who are, in the German in the German requirements, for example, to use public transport, they have this thing called 2G, which includes people that have recovered from the virus, which are essentially are regarded as being as good as vaccinated. And if you can prove that you've recovered from COVID, then essentially the assumption is that your antibodies are essentially commensurate with. I mean, I would tend to think that the antibodies would probably would hold you in a better position than if you have the vaccine, because if you have the vaccine, you only have antibodies against one protein, whereas if you have a kind of natural immunity, you're probably going to have a much more resilient form of herd immunity. And so in some sense, from a public health perspective, I think it's certainly an open question, and we should probably listen to Sunetra Gupta, Professor Sunetra Gupta of Oxford, who had a completely different public health policy proposal for what societies and governments should be doing for their populations. But that was all swallowed up in the hysteria and the lack of public discourse and debate over this issue. And, you can see that, essentially the idea that you need to vaccinate everyone follows a false presupposition that it's possible to eradicate the virus. The idea that everyone should just be vaccinated only kind of works, I propose, if you actually have any chance of being able to completely exterminate the virus. If you can't exterminate the virus, then wanting to vaccinate everyone, I would argue, is actually contrary to the long-term public health, because then essentially you're going to create a herd immunity through vaccination, which is going to be lost at the point at which that particular protein that the vaccine is providing resilience against is mutated around by a COVID virus, which are prone to mutation. So it's a very the whole thing is sort of has so many holes in it in terms of the public health response, and in some sense you can see almost that the demand for increased vaccination, I would argue, is a kind of doubling down, because to justify all the other kind of self-caused harm, the secondary damage that has been caused by this overreaching, hysterical political response, and the kind of groupthink that we get from the international community along the same grounds, or along the same lines of argument, which is in some sense just a testament to how weak our institutions are, because the executive, the political, should have been held back by the judiciary, saying, no, you can't just keep on making these precautionary measures. It's not reasonable. It might hypothetically be rational, but it's not reasonable, just because you haven't collected the data to actually prove that it would be useful to have this kind of precaution. The precaution is unsubstantiated. It's not properly substantiated to the point at which that you can infringe the liberal order. You can suggest to private individuals that they should modify their behavior, and you should perhaps give them advice if you want to do so, but you can't mandate their behavior. You can try to educate and inform. And if you really want to provide a lower death toll or something like that, then you can focus on your actual side of the equation, which is that you can do something about public health. You can expand public health resources. Sorry, I'm skipping over an important point here, but something about the double standards and the precaution. Okay, I'm somewhat conflating double standards with also essentially shifting the burden of proof onto the adversarial position or onto the other side of the argument. So essentially that these people with their COVID public health policy have dishonestly shifted the burden of proof and then essentially get to use a kind of skepticism against anyone who contradicts or their argument and their line, when they have not ever properly substantiated the reasonableness of the measures which they implore or which they call for or demand of the political establishment. And again, I mean, when you do something like quarantining the healthy, I mean, the basic question is, well, when does it end? When can it ever end? And, the kinds of suffering that this kind of problem causes, and the other kinds of suffering which is not being properly calculated, essentially by locking people down, is probably much better decided by individual people who are perhaps informed about the risks and the dangers. And how to mitigate those risks and those dangers. But also essentially that this virus essentially is not that deadly for healthy people. And, or at least for people who don't have particular kinds of comorbid conditions that make them particularly prone. But essentially, I would generally say that the vaccine should only be indicated for people who essentially cannot survive, who proximately, it can be assessed, will not have an easy time surviving COVID without some kind of special intervention, which is predominantly the elderly and people with pulmonary and sort of and lung and heart kind of conditions and obesity. Anyway, I mean that's a kind of factual kind of those are factual details and factual claims to make. But essentially, these kinds of measures, they should have been struck down in law. I mean, it's also how can a government? I mean, I've heard disgusting things that, for example, hospital policies that people that have not been vaccinated will not be admitted into the ICU. And I believe that that's not under triage circumstances when they've run out of capacity. That's just in general. You will not be admitted into a hospital. ICU without a vaccine. I mean, this is essentially a kind of punitive medical apartheid. I mean, this is absolutely, I mean, the social justice has been infringed, certainly on this ground. But in some sense, it just shows just how useless the vaccine is. That nurses can't be confident that they have been vaccinated and that they have a proper protection, that somehow this punitive measure must be taken against people for not falling in line. But also, it's, I think, slightly incorrect that how can how can hospital administrators who are trying to enforce this kind of draconian policy, this unconstitutional policy, I would argue as well, how can they enforce such a policy without penetrating the veil of patient doctor confidentiality? How can hospital administrators that wish to enforce a draconian policy, how can they extract the information that they get to take the position of healthcare provider, and therefore they get to be privy to the the private medical details of a patient, that they can know your vaccine status, so that then they can enforce such a draconian policy against an individual? I would argue that there's a kind of procedural um, malfeasance there that also breaks the liberal order. So is it that the doctor technically has the right to know if you've been vaccinated or not, because obviously they need to know that in order to give you effective treatment? Then the doctor tattles on you to the hospital administrator, and then the hospital administrator says you cannot be a ward in this hospital. We can't take you in because it's our policy that the unvaccinated do not go into the ICU. You know, at what level does this work? And so, I mean, anyway, I'm just pointing out that there are things have failed here. Essentially, you know, I can somewhat understand in a case of triage when you can say, well, lots of people are potentially dying. We only have so many ICU beds, and they're not enough to go around. We are going to privilege the people who took the vaccination, because we're going to make a moral judgment that people who took the vaccination um, wanted to live more, and they did every precaution that they could, and therefore we're going to endorse their precautionary measure taking, and we're going to give them preferential treatment. And we're not just going to say, well, who is further or closer to death's door, and make that kind of determination, that we can essentially make a kind of on the spot prognosis and say this person has a higher chance of living than that person, therefore uh, we'll give the person who is more likely responsive to ICU treatments, we're going to give them the treatment, and we're going to triage the others. Instead, we're going to make the determination, you know. So, I mean, I can understand it somewhat becomes more in the realm of medical decision making, I think, when you're in a situation of triage. But when you have a blanket standard that you just say, if you're unvaccinated, you don't get to go into the ICU, and I wonder really if that includes non-COVID related. I mean, you know, does that mean that if you're in a car accident and you're unvaccinated, will you not be permitted to enter the ICU? And we must remember that, I mean, there's a lot of, I would say, misinformation around the vaccine. The vaccine itself, it has not been properly tested. In fact, all the data that we have about it, about its 95% success rate, these are studies that were conducted in a very haphazard way. A lot of people who get vaccinated, they develop full blown COVID within 2 weeks of getting vaccinated. And a lot of people, well, when this happens to people, it's usually people that are more comorbid or more immunosuppressed. And so it would actually be more useful to work out, what's going on with them. And because in some sense, those are the only people we really should be caring about vaccinating, is the immunosuppressed people, not the healthy people. But essentially, when they did these studies, they removed all those people who got COVID within 2 weeks of getting the vaccine. They removed them from the studies. They don't form part of the 95% success rate. So we've got a 95% success rate of people who get the COVID vaccine, of people who were already quite healthy, essentially people who didn't even need the vaccine essentially in the first place. So what does this 95% statistic mean? I think it means very little. We already know that the vaccine doesn't really help in controlling the transmission of the virus. So what is it good for, really? It's such a weak, half-assed sort of protection that therefore we must mandate it because it's so pitiful. I mean, is that the rationale of public health? Is that we have to prove that what we've already administered to people makes sense? That we have to double down to sort of prove that it is efficacious on some level? Or are they sort of lining themselves up for when the virus does mutate against the antibody that's in the vaccine, that then they can blame the unvaccinated and say that they tried everything that they could to increase the vaccination rates, because in some sense the magical thinking attached to that is that if we had more people vaccinated, it would prevent mutation. Which, if anything, it's the contrary. If we kept the vaccine only for the vulnerable, and we let otherwise the rest of the healthy population in our society gain natural immunity, there would be less of a selective pressure to force the virus to mutate against the vaccine. If we use the vaccine more sparingly and we developed a more natural herd immunity, a more broad-based protein, we would essentially encourage the virus as well to mutate towards probably becoming less deadly. I mean, that's really what you want. I mean, humanity has never gotten rid of the cold and the flu. It's never eradicated any of these things. Australia did manage to eradicate COVID-19. Well done, Australia. How well did that do for Australia? They just deferred everything into the future. When does it end? It just shows, what happens when you have essentially sloppy, kind of idealistic objectives and supposed goals, and then you're willing to kind of reverse engineer your moral thinking to arrive at that. And I didn't lay this out, but essentially, we've got a journalism which is completely obsessed with broadcasting systemic oppression narratives and essentially providing to the mob scapegoats and representatives of systemic oppression to be fed to the mob and to feed the outrage and to essentially be the one to point the finger in the witch hunts. That's what we've got. We've got a journalism which is set up for a fascistic culture. They're completely illiberal. Their definition of robust debate is them being able to do their show trials, do their unilateral narrative witchcraft, and sort of compelling people to answer their same question, which is premised on their same illiberal fundamental standard, which is baked into their disgusting fascistic worldview. All they have to do is identify systemic oppression, and then all the moral conflation and the dogpiling ensues. And they can't break out of that formula. And we don't have the requisite institutional integrity. We do have it on paper, but we don't in practice have the requisite institutional integrity to stand up against this. We don't have judges. We did have some judges making some judgments against certain lockdown restrictions. But by and large, we've been railroaded, we've been steamrolled. The Constitution has been steamrolled. And the South African Human Rights Commission has essentially fallen in line with their political masters. Because essentially they have already been programmed by this formula of systemic oppression. They've already been radicalized by identity politics. They are essentially a fascistic institution of an institutionalized corruption and betrayal of the South African Constitution. I mean, these are people that should be tried for constitutional damages. We need a kind of Nuremberg trials, and we need impeachments. These office holders are wicked miscreants because of their moral pollution, because of how they have abetted. They're essentially political hacks. They're partisan political plants put there to service authoritarian state power, essentially, that has not been substantiated. And the only thing that they have going for them is the fashionable that this is a global fad right now. That the hysteria is broad enough that they can sort of then they can join the chorus, and then they can add to it and say, oh, well, this is the reasonable consensus, because otherwise why does everyone just go along with it, and why does everyone just agree, and we're just another corrupt institution to raise our hands to do the Hitler salute. That's what they are. A group of disgusting ideologues. They don't understand social justice. They don't have real moral standards. I mean, this is slightly broadening the issue, but essentially they are a liberal hacks. They're one of the signs of our times, of the wormwood that we suffer from. And, I should probably go on to. This is a separate sort of issue, but I was thinking about the Democratic Alliance in South Africa, which is an opposition party, the official opposition party, the largest opposition party, and just, sort of how it hasn't reclaimed and recovered from the damage that was done to it by Mmusi Maimane. I mean, I think in 2019, before the elections, there was an interview between Eusebius Mkhize and Mmusi Maimane. And that the quality of the substance exchanged in that interview. I mean, what is? Let me just give a summary. What you see in that interview is two black fascists arguing and quibbling about the kind of moral double standards, and Mmusi Maimane puts very weak argument. I mean, in terms of how he has to kind of conflate morality and conflate reality to the extent to which that he can sort of follow the gist of Eusebius Mkhize's questions about essentially how much retribution in land redistribution or land restitution should there be, how much vengeance and revenge, and Mmusi Maimane doesn't even, I think, properly represent the actual scope of the issue, which is that the idea that people who had their land taken from them from, let's say, an imperialistic, white racist government, which is essentially we must remember, was done under a different time, was done under a time in which might makes right, in which there wasn't a common citizenry. We didn't have liberal rights. Essentially, the right of conquest was how the world works. The right of conquest is the default position. What stops the default position is something like a liberal order, is something like a rights-based society in which everyone's dignity is guaranteed. And the reason why you can't just give nil compensation to people is because usually the people who currently own the land are not the same people who took the land. Land has passed on. It has been bought and sold. As if the country itself cannot afford land reform. Of course the country itself can afford land reform. It's just that the budget has been stolen twice over. So this false reduction and this passing of the buck, this moving of the goalpost to essentially, in a principled way, let's talk about giving nil compensation, because wouldn't that make us prove that we care about the black identity and that we care about racial justice? In principle. And then Musi Maimane is essentially giving such a weak, well, he's not even giving any resistance to that. He is in principle conceding to the fascistic point, and then Eusebius Makaisa is raking him over the coals for saying, well, I don't really believe how, you pretend to be a liberal moral fascist, but I don't really believe, I'm not convinced by you. Your position seems to be slightly half-hearted. And in some sense, that was the problem with Musi Maimane's position, is that it is a fascistic moral position, but he's trying to weld it, he's trying to bring it together with, let's say, general liberal principles, and it just doesn't fit together. It just doesn't plug in. And the party still has not recovered from this because it has not stood. It needs to relitigate that interview. It needs to know what it would say against Eusebius Makaisa in that interview. It needs to work out how to make a moral position that is actually can be followed as justifiable, that rectifies the answers to those questions which Eusebius Makaisa is raising. And in some sense, you can't answer the questions because the questions are fundamentally evil questions made by a fascistic journalist. You actually have to attack the character of the journalist, and you have to attack the character of his morality. You have to do that. You have to make a completely, and obviously Eusebius Makaisa would not allow that on his show, because fascism only works if you hold the moral orthodoxy and you get to sort of pelt your skeptical shifting of the burden of proof onto other people. So Eusebius Makaisa will always be able to protect his unassailable moral grandstanding and sanctimony because he only lets people on his show that will allow him to retain the moral high ground. He will and he will talk over people and he will say that this is my show, essentially. So the only way to really offer an actual critique as to what he is doing is to essentially mirror what he is doing and do it to him. Essentially, you have to call him immoral and then insult him on a personal level, because that's what identity politics does, is that it seemingly makes a moral principled point, and then what it does is it makes a kind of character assassination. It makes a kind of underhanded aspersion against the moral character that you have. And in some sense, if you can't do it back at them, to at least show that there's an insoluble conflagration, that there's a that's the best that you can do, to kind of show that kind of political polemic that Eusebius Makaisa is raising essentially is capable of justifying any expediency because it is already involved in a false expediency. They've created a hysterical emergency, and they can just keep on doubling down on their precautionary measures which they keep on advocating for and promoting for. And so they can do anything, and at the same time they can insulate themselves from criticism through the new double down precautionary measure. So they've got a negative feedback which is impossible really to actually assail. You have to actually make a general polemic against them. You have to prosecute them. If you don't prosecute their position, and this is why the DA essentially loses in terms of the public debate, is because why should the oversight of the official opposition matter if they have already been accused of not providing oversight, essentially, because that's the ideological contention, is that the DA is not a legitimate opposition party. It is a cover for white monopoly capital. And if you're not going to actually prosecute people, indict people, morally go after people who make that kind of claim and take them down, then you're not providing oversight. You have been labeled, and you have not dispelled the label against your good name. And you might be able to continually defend yourself, but because you won't prosecute your position, it goes to authenticity, it goes to credibility, it goes to the lack of conviction. Essentially means that when you're against a Eusebius Mackiser, you either go into a stalemate or you lose, because Eusebius Mackiser will escalate his voice and will control the narrative and will eventually say it's my show. I would rather go onto the Eusebius Mackiser show and get ejected from it because I raised my voice over him raising his voice. That would be a better mark of conviction, of authenticity, of credibility, is to make the division, make the delineation, make the distinction. Because right now it's their side who is telling the whole of society that they must choose sides. There's no liberal voice out there that says, no, you must choose the open, liberal, democratic, constitutional values. And also it's problematic to try to do so because they've claimed the title of social justice, and no one has tried to take it back from them. You can't win this debate without the Constitution on your side. You can't win this debate without social justice on your side. And no one has made a claim to unfuck the Constitution, to resurrect it, to recover the Constitution. No one has made that claim. No one has said, no, the president is not a non-racialist because he uses the word non-racialism in a hollow way with hollow lip service. Half the time he says things that are blatantly racialistic. He stands for policies which are blatantly corrupt and racialistic. It's unconstitutional, but the Constitutional Court has made this a governmental prerogative, which means that they're not even properly testing it according to the Constitution. They're not using the sub-clauses in the limitations clause to test the racialist legislation. Now, there is a way of indicting the courts on that ground, because the courts need to be indicted for that institutional corruption, but there's a way of framing it where you're not explicitly saying that they are institutionally corrupt, but where they have inappropriately made this a partisan political democratic issue, which I would argue essentially infringes constitutional supremacy, because they are no longer caring if acts of parliament are inconsistent with the Constitution, because they basically said, no, democracy has a trump card over the supremacy of the Constitution, at least on this matter, on the matter of essentially redefining non-racialism, which is utterly preposterous. And also there are more arguments to be made about expropriation without compensation must also be constitutionally tested against the limitations clause, because an act of parliament that seeks to amend the Constitution needs to pass through the limitations clause, because an act of parliament is just like anything else. It must be tested against inconsistency with the Constitution and with its fundamental values. Because we have constitutional supremacy, not democratic supremacy, because we don't live in a democracy. We live in an open, liberal democracy, where the justice is enshrined within the republic, not within the democracy. And amending the Constitution, I mean, unless they're going to amend the limitations clause as well, which I think is actually kind of impossible. I don't think the limitations clause can be amended. There's a similar argument in the American amendment, the 14th Amendment, which kind of has the closest thing to what they have to the rule of law. the guarantee of sort of a kind of substantive due process. Anyway, but comparing us with America is problematic. In fact, that's what got us into this mess in the first place. That's how our law became institutionally corrupted, where it invented this disgusting alien concept of a governmental prerogative, which didn't even exist for apartheid. When apartheid tried to make a high court of parliament, the judges struck it down. They thought it was laughable. But now our judges have invented a governmental prerogative, and they have shirked their duty to test for constitutional inconsistency. It's utterly pathetic. It's institutional corruption. Anyway, might have to move at some point to the point at which the Western Cape becomes the only remaining bastion of the South African Constitution, to put the rest of the country to shame for its betrayal and institutionalized corruption, but also its kind of indulging in its democratic illiteracy. But in some sense, there is special blame to be laid at the foot of the journalists that have brought us to this dark place.